December 1944. The Allies were confident. Victory in Europe was a matter of time. But in the snowy darkness of the Ardennes forest, Adolf Hitler prepared one last, terrifying masterstroke, a desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and change the course of the war. Today, we explore the surprise offensive that threw the Western Front into chaos. A brutal, month-long battle fought not just against tanks and men, but against the paralyzing cold and thick winter fog. It was the moment American resilience met its greatest test. This is the winter of desperation. This is the Battle of the Bulge. In the winter of 1944, the Second World War in Europe appeared to be approaching its inevitable conclusion. Allied armies, having liberated France and Belgium, stood on Germany's western border. The Soviet Red Army was driving through Poland toward Germany from the east. Berlin was under constant bombardment. Nazi Germany, which had once conquered a continent, was now being crushed from all sides. But in mid-December 1944, in the dense forests of the Ardennes region on the border between Belgium and Germany, Hitler was preparing one final, desperate gamble, a massive counteroffensive that would strike with such fury and surprise that it would shock the Allies, split their armies, and potentially change the course of the war. This is the story of the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive in the West, the largest battle fought by the United States Army in the entire war, and a desperate struggle waged in the depths of winter against both the enemy and the elements. By December 1944, Germany's strategic position was desperate. In the east, Soviet forces had liberated most of Poland and were approaching the German frontier. In the south, Allied forces were pushing through Italy. In the west, American, British, and Canadian armies had crossed into Germany itself in several places and were preparing for the final assault into the Reich. German cities were being systematically destroyed by Allied strategic bombing. The German economy was collapsing. Oil supplies were critically short. Manpower reserves were nearly exhausted. By any rational calculation, Germany should have sought peace terms while it still had bargaining power. But Hitler was not rational, and he would not consider surrender. Instead, he planned an offensive, a massive all-or-nothing attack that would split the Allied armies, recapture the vital Belgian port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to concentrate all its remaining strength against the Soviet Union. The plan, codenamed Watch on the Rhine, a deliberately defensive-sounding name to disguise preparations for an offensive, called for 3 German armies to attack through the Ardennes forest in eastern Belgium and Luxembourg, driving northwest toward the Meuse River and ultimately to Antwerp. The Ardennes was chosen for specific reasons. First, it was where the Germans had successfully attacked in 1940, breaking through weak French defenses and winning the campaign in the west. Hitler believed lightning could strike twice in the same place. Second, the terrain favored surprise. The Ardennes was a region of dense forests, steep hills, and narrow roads, difficult tank country that the Allies believed the Germans would avoid. The American forces holding this sector were thinly spread. Some divisions were green, newly arrived in Europe, while others were exhausted units recovering from recent battles. It was the quiet sector of the Allied line, where nothing was expected to happen. German preparations were conducted in absolute secrecy. Troop movements occurred at night. Radio silence was strictly enforced. Fake radio traffic suggested defensive preparations elsewhere. Allied intelligence detected some German buildup but concluded it was defensive, a response to expected Allied attacks, not preparation for a German offensive. The Germans assembled approximately 200,000 troops, 600 tanks and assault guns, and 1,900 artillery pieces for the initial assault. 3 armies would attack: the 6th Panzer Army under SS Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich in the north, the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel in the center, and the 7th Army under General Erich Brandenberger in the south. Hitler also authorized a special operation, Operation Griffin, commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, the commando who had rescued Mussolini in 1943. Scorzeny would lead a brigade of English-speaking German soldiers dressed in American uniforms, driving captured American vehicles. They would infiltrate behind American lines, change road signs, cut communications, spread confusion, and possibly even capture bridges over the Meuse River. It was a violation of the laws of war. Soldiers captured wearing enemy uniforms could be executed as spies. But Hitler believed the potential impact justified the risk. On the American side, the Ardennes sector was held by 8 Corps under General Troy Middleton. The Corps held an 80-mile front with just 4 divisions, far fewer than doctrinal standards suggested. But this was considered acceptable because the Ardennes was quiet, because American forces were concentrated elsewhere for planned offensives, and because nobody expected the Germans to attack through such difficult terrain in winter. The divisions holding the line included the 106th Infantry Division, which had just arrived in Europe and had never been in combat, and the 28th Infantry Division, which had been badly mauled in the Hurtgen Forest and was in the Ardennes to rest and rebuild. They were positioned opposite the main German attack routes. On the night of December 15th to 16th, 1944, the Ardennes was quiet. Snow covered the ground. Fog hung in the valleys. American soldiers in their foxholes and bunkers prepared for another routine night on a quiet front. Some were writing letters home. Others were sleeping. Officers planned for Christmas, now just 9 days away. Nobody expected what dawn would bring. But in the German lines, assault troops were moving into position. Tank engines were running, warming up in the cold. Artillery crews prepared their guns. Officers synchronized watches. And at 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, the order was given. The last German offensive in the West was about to begin. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, the pre-dawn darkness over the Ardennes was shattered by the flash and thunder of 1,900 German artillery pieces opening fire simultaneously. For 90 minutes, shells rained down on American positions, targeting command posts, communication centers, artillery batteries, road junctions, and forward defensive positions. American soldiers, many of them asleep in their foxholes, woke to find themselves under the heaviest bombardment they had experienced. Communications lines were cut. Buildings collapsed. Some positions were obliterated. Survivors huddled in whatever cover they could find, unable to respond, unable to call for help, barely able to comprehend what was happening. At approximately 7 a.m., as dawn broke gray and foggy over the Ardennes, the German infantry and armor attacked. From the fog and snow emerged columns of German tanks, Panthers and Tigers and Mark IVs, supported by infantry. American defenders, still recovering from the bombardment, suddenly found themselves engaged in close combat. The initial German advances were rapid. The 6th Panzer Army in the north, Hitler's main effort, pushed forward against stiff resistance from American units that quickly organized defensive positions. But in the center, 5th Panzer Army made better progress, finding gaps in American lines and pushing through with alarming speed. But even in the chaos of the initial breakthrough, an atrocity occurred that would define American attitudes toward the German offensive. On the first day of the attack, a combat group from the 1st SS Panzer Division under SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Paper, Kampfgruppe Paper, encountered a lightly armed American convoy near the Belgian town of Normandy. The Americans surrendered. They were disarmed and herded into a field. And then, without warning, German SS troops opened fire with machine guns. Over 80 American prisoners of war were murdered in what became known as the Normandy Massacre. Word of the massacre spread rapidly through American units. The effect was to stiffen resistance. American soldiers who might have considered surrendering when surrounded instead fought to the death or attempted to escape. The massacre, while horrific, ultimately worked against German objectives by strengthening American determination. Kampfgruppe Paper would continue its advance, becoming the deepest German penetration of the offensive, but would ultimately be stopped and forced to abandon its vehicles, with survivors escaping on foot. Across the Ardennes, American units fought desperately to slow the German advance. The 106th Infantry Division, caught in the northern sector, found 2 of its regiments surrounded on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge. Cut off, low on ammunition, and unable to break out, approximately 7,000 American soldiers surrendered on December 19, one of the largest mass surrenders of American forces in the European theater. But their resistance, even in defeat, had bought time, crucial days that allowed other American units to establish defensive positions further west. Other units fought with greater success. At St. Vith, a critical road junction, American forces, including elements of the 7th Armored Division rushed south from the north, established a defensive perimeter and held it for 6 days against repeated German attacks. St. Vith controlled key roads the Germans needed for their advance. Its defense disrupted German timetables and channeled German armor onto secondary roads that were often too narrow or too weak to support heavy vehicles. At Elsenborn Ridge in the northern sector, American forces stopped the 6th Panzer Army completely, preventing it from reaching the Meuse. The elite SS Panzer divisions, which Hitler had counted on to lead the breakthrough, were stalled by determined American resistance and by the difficult terrain. Allied commanders, initially confused by scattered and contradictory reports, gradually realized the scale of the German offensive. On December 17, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, meeting with his senior commanders, made critical decisions. All available reserves would be rushed to the Ardennes. The 101st Airborne Division and 82nd Airborne Division, recovering from the Market Garden operation in Holland, would be trucked south immediately. Patton's Third Army, engaged in offensive operations in the Saar region, would disengage, turn north, and attack the southern flank of the German penetration. By December 19th, the shape of the battle was becoming clear. German forces had driven a massive Bulge, a salient, into the Allied lines. At its deepest, the Bulge extended over 50 miles westward from the original front line. The Germans had not reached the Meuse River, let alone Antwerp, but they had created a crisis that threatened the entire Allied position in Belgium. The weather, meanwhile, favored the Germans. Heavy cloud cover, fog, and snow grounded Allied aircraft. The overwhelming Allied air superiority that had dominated the battlefield since Normandy was neutralized. German columns could move in daylight without fear of air attack. Supply convoys could reach forward units. For the first time in months, the Germans fought without Allied fighter bombers hunting them. Operation Greif, Skorzony's infiltration operation, had mixed results. Some German commandos in American uniforms successfully cut telephone lines, changed road signs, and spread rumors of German parachutists behind Allied lines. The psychological impact was significant. American forces instituted security checks, questioning soldiers about American culture and sports to identify German infiltrators. But the operation achieved nothing strategically significant, and several commandos were captured. Those caught in American uniforms were tried as spies and executed. Skorzony himself, commanding his unit in combat rather than infiltration after the initial phase failed, fought conventionally for the remainder of the battle. But the critical battle, the place where the German offensive would be decided, was forming around a small Belgian market town that controlled a vital road network, Bastogne. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the roads the Germans needed to reach the Meuse and continue their advance. And the race to Bastogne between German forces driving west and American reinforcements rushing south would determine the battle's outcome. The 101st Airborne Division, alerted on December 17th, loaded onto trucks and drove through the night toward Bastogne. They arrived on December 18th, just hours before German forces surrounded the town. Also in Bastogne were elements of the 10th Armored Division, artillery units, and various support troops. The commander of the 101st, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in the United States. Command fell to the Assistant Division Commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. By December 20th, Bastogne was completely surrounded. German forces had bypassed it to the north and south and continued west, but they could not ignore it. As long as Bastogne held, it disrupted German supply lines and blocked key roads. The Germans would have to either capture it or contain it with forces that could be used elsewhere. Inside Bastogne, approximately 18,000 American troops prepared to withstand a siege. Supplies were limited. Medical facilities were inadequate. The weather was bitterly cold, and German forces surrounding the town outnumbered the defenders. The siege of Bastogne would become legendary, an isolated garrison, surrounded, outnumbered, fighting in freezing conditions, holding a vital position against overwhelming odds. It would produce one of the most famous moments in American military history, and it would become a symbol of American determination and resilience. But before that moment came, American forces in Bastogne had to survive German attacks, endure constant artillery bombardment, cope with dwindling supplies, and maintain their will to resist despite the apparent hopelessness of their situation. The real test of Bastogne, and of the Battle of the Bulge itself, was about to begin. Inside Bastogne, the situation deteriorated rapidly. German forces completely surrounded the town by December 21st, cutting all ground supply routes. Artillery shells fell continuously on American positions. German infantry and armor probed the perimeter, testing for weak points. The defenders, fighting from foxholes and cellars, repelled attack after attack, but ammunition was running low, medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and casualties were mounting. The weather was brutal. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Snow fell continuously. Soldiers in foxholes suffered from frostbite and trench foot. The wounded lay in makeshift aid stations, cellars and churches, where medical personnel did what they could with limited supplies. On December 22nd, German forces sent a delegation under a flag of truce to the American lines. They carried a written surrender demand, addressed to the American commander in Bastogne. The message noted that German forces completely surrounded the town, that resistance was futile, that continued fighting would result in the destruction of the garrison, and that the Germans offered honorable surrender terms. The message was delivered to General McAuliffe. His initial response, to his staff, was a single word: nuts. His staff suggested he formalize his reply, so McAuliffe wrote out a response, to the German commander, nuts. The American commander. The German officers who had delivered the surrender demand were confused by the colloquial American expression. An American officer explained, "It means go to hell." The Germans returned to their lines with McAuliffe's reply. Nuts became legendary, a perfect encapsulation of American defiance, humor in the face of danger, and refusal to surrender despite overwhelming odds. It boosted morale not just in Bastogne but across the Allied armies when word spread. But defiance alone could not hold Bastogne indefinitely. The garrison needed relief, and that relief was coming from the south, driven by one of the most remarkable command decisions and logistical feats of the war. On December 19th, General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army engaged in offensive operations southeast of the Bulge, had attended Eisenhower's conference in Verdun. When asked how quickly he could disengage from his current offensive, turn his entire army 90 degrees north, and attack the southern flank of the German penetration, Patton replied, 2 days. His staff had already prepared contingency plans. Other commanders were skeptical. Turning an entire army, 3 full corps, over 250,000 men, with thousands of vehicles, 90 degrees in the middle of winter, on icy roads, while maintaining supply and communications, seemed impossible in 2 days. But Patton kept his promise. By December 22nd, Third Army was attacking north toward Bastogne. The advance was slow, German resistance was fierce, the roads were icy, and the weather was terrible, but Patton's forces ground forward, day by day, mile by mile, pushing toward the besieged garrison. The critical factor that would ultimately decide the battle was the weather. On December 23rd, after a week of heavy cloud cover, fog, and snow, the skies began to clear. Allied aircraft, fighters, bombers, and transport planes took to the air in massive numbers. Fighter bombers attacked German armor columns stalled on narrow roads, destroying tanks and trucks by the hundreds. Heavy bombers struck German supply lines, fuel depots, and rail junctions. And most critically for Bastogne, C-47 transport aircraft flew supply missions, dropping ammunition, medical supplies, and food to the besieged garrison. On December 23rd and 24th alone, over 1,000 Allied aircraft flew supply missions to Bastogne. The defenders, who had been rationing ammunition and caring for the wounded without adequate medical supplies, suddenly had what they needed to continue fighting. Morale soared. The siege could be endured. For the Germans, the clearing weather was catastrophic. Their columns, which had been able to move relatively freely under cloud cover, were now attacked continuously from the air. Fuel supplies, already critically short, could not reach forward units because Allied aircraft destroyed the supply convoys. German armor, stopped on roads by destroyed lead vehicles, became targets for fighter bombers that would methodically destroy entire columns. The German offensive, which had depended on speed and surprise, had lost both. The advance had stalled well short of the Meuse River. Key objectives like Bastogne remained in Allied hands. And now, with Allied air power returned, German forces were being systematically destroyed. On December 26th, just 10 days after the German offensive began, elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through German lines south of Bastogne and made contact with the 101st Airborne. The siege was lifted. Supplies and reinforcements could reach the garrison. The defenders had held. Bastogne had become a symbol of American determination, of the ability to withstand overwhelming odds, of refusing to surrender even when surrounded. But it was more than symbolic. By holding Bastogne, American forces had disrupted German timetables, blocked key roads, and forced the Germans to commit forces to contain the garrison that could have been used to continue the advance. While Bastogne dominated headlines and captured imaginations, the broader Battle of the Bulge continued across a wide front. In the north, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, given temporary command of American forces north of the Bulge, organized a defense that stopped German advances toward the Meuse. British armor moved into reserve positions, ready to counterattack if German forces broke through. In the center, American forces slowly compressed the German salient from both sides. Each day brought small gains, a village recaptured, a ridge seized. German forces pushed back incrementally. The fighting was brutal, conducted in freezing temperatures, deep snow, and against determined German resistance. The Battle of the Bulge became a battle of attrition. German forces, unable to advance further, attempted to hold the ground they had taken. American forces attacked from the north and south, gradually reducing the Bulge, squeezing German forces into an increasingly small pocket. Every day, German strength diminished, not just from combat losses but from breakdowns, lack of fuel, and the constant attrition of Allied air attacks. For the soldiers on both sides, the Battle of the Bulge was defined as much by the weather and terrain as by enemy action. Temperatures regularly dropped below 0 Fahrenheit. Snow was often waist deep. Soldiers suffered from frostbite, trench foot, and exposure. Simply surviving the night in a foxhole required constant vigilance. Soldiers had to move periodically to prevent freezing, but movement drew enemy fire. The wounded faced terrible conditions. Medics struggled to reach casualties in deep snow under fire. Evacuating the wounded required carrying them on stretchers through forest and snow, exhausting work that exposed both patient and carriers to enemy fire. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. Surgeons performed amputations on soldiers whose frostbitten limbs had become gangrenous. For tankers, conditions were equally brutal. Tank interiors were freezing. Engines had to be run periodically to prevent freezing up, revealing tank positions to enemy artillery. Moving tanks off roads risked becoming stuck in snow or mud. Visibility was often near zero in blowing snow. By early January 1945, the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge was no longer in doubt. German forces were in retreat, withdrawing eastward under constant Allied pressure and air attack. The Bulge was being systematically reduced. German casualties were mounting catastrophically. and Hitler's gamble had clearly failed. On January 3rd, Allied forces launched coordinated counterattacks from north and south. British and American forces attacked from the north. Patton's Third Army continued pressing from the south. The German salient was compressed day by day. By January 16th, American forces attacking from north and south met at Houffalize, effectively cutting the Bulge in half. German forces that had not already withdrawn were trapped or forced to abandon their heavy equipment and escape on foot through the snow. By January 25, 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was officially over. Allied forces had pushed German forces back to approximately the positions they had held on December 15th. The Bulge had been eliminated. The German offensive had been defeated. But the cost had been staggering. American casualties exceeded 80,000, approximately 19,000 killed, 48,000 wounded, and 23,000 captured or missing. It was the bloodiest battle fought by the United States Army in World War II. British casualties added another 1,400. German casualties were even worse, approximately 100,000, including killed, wounded, and captured, along with 800 tanks destroyed or abandoned. But beyond the casualty statistics lay the strategic reality. Hitler's last gamble had failed completely. The offensive had not reached Antwerp. It had not split the Allied armies. It had not forced a negotiated peace. Instead, it had consumed Germany's last mobile reserves, destroyed irreplaceable panzer divisions, and hastened Germany's final defeat. The aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge saw German forces retreating in disorder, pursued by Allied armies that were now fully on the offensive. The Wehrmacht, which had scraped together its last reserves for the Ardennes Offensive, no longer had the strength to mount significant resistance. The road to the Rhine River, and beyond it to the heart of Germany, lay open. Hitler's decision to launch the Ardennes Offensive, rather than using those same forces to defend against the Soviet offensive building in the east, was one of his greatest strategic blunders. The divisions committed to the Bulge, particularly the SS Panzer divisions, were precisely what was needed to defend against the Red Army. Instead, they were thrown away in a hopeless offensive that achieved nothing. When the Soviets launched their massive Vistula-Oder offensive on January 12, 1945, while the Battle of the Bulge was still being fought, German defenses in the east collapsed. The Soviets advanced hundreds of miles in weeks, reaching the Oder River, just 40 miles from Berlin, by early February. The forces that might have slowed or stopped this advance were trapped in the Ardennes or retreating in disarray. For the American military, the Battle of the Bulge provided valuable lessons, some learned at terrible cost. The danger of assuming a quiet sector would remain quiet. The importance of maintaining adequate reserves. The need for better intelligence and attention to warning signs. The value of small unit leadership and initiative when command structures broke down. But the battle also demonstrated American strengths, the ability to recover quickly from surprise and disaster, the effectiveness of combined arms, infantry, armor, artillery, and air power working together, and perhaps most importantly, the resilience and determination of the American soldier fighting under the worst possible conditions. For the soldiers who fought in the Bulge, on both sides, the experience was defining. American veterans spoke of the brutal cold, the confusion of the first days, the determination to hold despite being surrounded, the relief when the skies finally cleared and Allied aircraft appeared overhead. Many considered the Bulge the hardest fighting they experienced in the entire war, harder than Normandy, harder than anything that followed. German veterans remembered the brief hope of the first days when it seemed the offensive might succeed, followed by the despair as Allied air power returned and it became clear the advance had stalled. They remembered retreating through the snow, abandoning vehicles for lack of fuel, losing friends to cold and enemy fire, knowing the war was lost but fighting on because orders demanded it. The Battle of the Bulge has entered American memory as one of the defining battles of World War II. The Siege of Bastogne, McAuliffe's Nuts, Reply, Patton's relief operation, these became legends, stories told and retold, symbols of American determination and courage under fire. But the battle was more than a collection of dramatic moments. It was the last time Germany would threaten Allied armies in the West. After the Bulge, the Wehrmacht was spent. The march to Berlin, delayed by weeks by the Ardennes Offensive, would resume in February 1945 and would not stop until Germany surrendered in May. In retrospect, Hitler's decision to launch the Ardennes Offensive was militarily insane but psychologically understandable. He could not accept defeat. He could not order a purely defensive strategy that would only delay the inevitable. He had to believe that one more bold stroke, one more gamble, might change Germany's fortunes. But the age of German military miracles had passed. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated that Allied superiority in men, material, and air power was overwhelming. Germany could still inflict heavy casualties, could still conduct local counterattacks, could still fight with skill and determination. But it could no longer change the strategic outcome. Today, the Ardennes is peaceful. The forests where American and German soldiers fought and died in the snow are quiet. Memorials mark the sites of battles: Bastogne, Saint-Vith, Malmedy. American military cemeteries hold the graves of thousands who died in the Bulge. Belgian and Luxembourgish people remember with gratitude the Americans who fought to liberate their countries a second time. The Battle of the Bulge. December 16, 1944, through January 25, 1945. 40 days of brutal winter combat. Hitler's last gamble. The bloodiest battle in American military history. A desperate German offensive that came close to success but ultimately hastened Germany's defeat. The soldiers who fought there, American, British, German, endured conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. They fought not just against each other but against cold, snow, and darkness. And when the battle ended, when the Bulge had been eliminated and German forces pushed back to their starting positions, the outcome of the war in Europe was no longer in doubt. The road to Berlin was open. The end was approaching. By the end of January 1945, the Bulge had been flattened. The Allied victory came at a terrible cost of over 80,000 casualties, yet the price paid by the German war machine was fatal. The losses in fuel, tanks, and trained men were irreparable. The battle ultimately proved to be the ultimate self-inflicted wound for Nazi Germany. It consumed the last of their strategic reserves and accelerated the final Allied push to the Rhine. The legacy of the Bulge is one of fierce American determination, from the isolated stands at Bastogne to the heroic effort of Patton's Third Army that broke the siege. It was a victory forged in the frozen forests of Belgium. If you want to understand how strategic desperation and extraordinary human endurance converged to shape the end of a world war, make sure you subscribe to History of Conflicts. Hit that notification bell and leave a comment below. We want to know, which was the more critical factor in the German defeat, the relentless American defense in the face of surprise, or the eventual clearing of the weather that unleashed Allied air power? Thanks for watching.